Just once the recording is started. I didn't want you guys interrupted. So there you go. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Corey. Hello, everybody. Good evening. Nice to see you virtually. Thank you for joining us. I'll just do a quick introduction. My name is Lucia Ferrara, lead recovery support specialist in the My First Year program at Caron. What we do is work with patients and families in their year and sometimes year plus after discharge to just support early recovery and all the changes and challenges and growth that comes along with that. So really looking forward to tonight and tonight's presentation and just being able to talk about the unique challenges that the holiday season bring for us. And, you know, I hope that this will be something that's helpful and valuable for everybody. So thanks for joining.
Thanks, Lucia. Hi, everyone. My name is Laura Holland. I am the program director of the My First Year Recovery Service. I work closely with Lucia, and we are very excited to have you all here this evening. We want this to be interactive as possible. So if you have questions, you can put them in the chat. If you're comfortable unmuting yourself and you want to speak with us, that's even better. Some of the things that we may talk about this evening, maybe it applies for you in the moment, maybe it's something in the past. If it doesn't fit, just store it for later. We often use the language of addict or alcoholic. We could also use substance use disorder, identified patient. So if there's ever a time during this presentation where the language doesn't quite fit for you or you're not sure who we're speaking of, just ask us and we'll clarify. So we look forward to spending the next hour and a half or hour and 20 minutes and so with you. And we'll just dive right in. We'll get started.
All right. I'm going to move us forward.
All right. So our focus this evening is really talking about the holiday season. And that could look like a lot of different things for different people. So what we want to do is start with all of you. And whether it be in the chat or like I just mentioned, you can unmute yourself. What do you think of when you think of the holiday season? Family?
Mm-hmm.
Parties.
Parties, yeah. Gathering with family, stress, Thanksgiving through New Year's, hustle and bustle, yes. Food, good answer, Dan. Stress, keep them coming, these are good.
Yeah.
Expectations.
Expectations, that's a big one.
Expectations, yes.
That could be an exhausting one as well. Anxiety, emotions. Okay. Does anyone else want to add any? Traditions, overwhelmed, worry?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Dealing with drinking at parties, keeping the peace, disappointment. So all of these answers, you are all in the right spot. So our hope is that really over, this discussion is that we're talking about all of these things, right? Like what comes up for people. Opportunity to wake up spiritually. I like that.
Mm-hmm. Nice.
Loneliness.
Mm-hmm.
So as you can see, just even being prompted with what do you think when you hear holiday season, stretched too thin, right? So we're going to talk about these different things that come up for us. And, the first section of this will really be like a bit of an icebreaker, like a get to know you a little bit with some of these answers and really just hearing the different perspectives that people feel and think. And then what do you do with all that, right? So our next slide is going to be some common answers or examples that we also hear from people. So if I'm a family member and I have a patient, a loved one in recovery, okay, that could be early recovery. So for some of you, this could be your first holiday season with your patient home. It could be your first holiday season with your patient still in treatment. Some of you, maybe depending on where you're at in this process, could have a patient currently struggling, right? Or just not really sure where they fit into this. So if you look at it as like a before, during, and after treatment, Some of you could fall into different kind of buckets with that, right? So really taking a look at what comes up for me when I think of the holiday season. So what is going to happen? Right? So for this this section particularly, we're going to really stay in that thought process. What's going to happen? There's so much to get done. This never goes well. Maybe we shouldn't go. I can just come up with an excuse, right? Because sometimes it's easier to just not go and not deal with it than to deal with the other things that come up for us, like some of you listed in the chat. Then for some of you, maybe it's not as anxiety provoking or as scary, and maybe it's something where it's like, I can't wait to wrap presents, or we're gonna bake cookies. And someone I think it was mentioned the word tradition in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
And then for some, it could be, I hope he doesn't drink too much. I hope she doesn't drink too much. Maybe we start thinking about ways that we can negotiate with, like, well, what am I willing to put up with? Like, how far will I let this go?
Mm-hmm.
The what ifs. What if it gets really bad? What if they are triggered? What if they don't want to leave when it's time to go? What if it goes well? What if it's not as bad as I'm projecting? Right? So sometimes we hear that phrase, what if, and we can kind of automatically go into this place of negativity or concern, but it could also go well, right? That's the other side of that coin. You might think, I don't want to deal with it. There's just a lot to deal with when it comes to the holiday season. Navigating recovery, navigating early recovery. Maybe someone's, they've come off a relapse, or it's not been that long since their last use.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes looking forward to spend time with family, especially if you think about the current time. Some of us, maybe you've not seen family in a year or two just because of COVID and such. So maybe this is the first time you're seeing people, and there is genuine excitement. And there might also be all of these other things, right? So the idea that both of these things can exist in the same place. You can be really excited for the holidays and have all of these thoughts going on in your mind as well. So learning how to manage those and how to navigate that can be really tricky. Does anyone want to add anything, or does anyone have any questions about this part? Go ahead, Lucia.
Okay, so I think some of these we might have covered in the last question, but we wanted to also just explore a little bit what feelings come up when we mention holiday season, or we're thinking about the holidays. And just to touch on a couple that were shared before: loneliness, disappointment, worry. Are there other things that come up in terms of feelings or emotions when we're thinking about holidays and holiday season? Dread. It's a heavy one. Fear, sadness, anxiety, stress. So the emotional connection to the memories of past years and what's happened before, absolutely. Disappointment. Anxiety about dealing with family members who are insensitive, certainly. Being triggered, yes. Yep, there's triggers again. Okay. Wanting to have peace, which is so hard to have. Absolutely. Or my traditions are no longer. So traditions are different, they're changing. Or maybe some of them are done. Having an understanding and knowing what the triggers are. Thank you. So again, I'll just kind of bring up some that come up a lot, and much of what you all shared are here. So a lot of these, I think, are weighted towards the negative, and I think just in the context of this presentation and the struggles that we experience in the holidays, are some of the content's going to be weighted that way. So joy comes up. There can be a lot of happiness and anticipation, as well as sadness or grief. And again, I can connect that to traditions changing or not being in place the way that they used to be. Anxiety, being stressed, being overwhelmed. There's so much that's happening. Our schedules get really full. There's a lot of expectation and anticipation, and that can really be a lot to deal with, and it can be very stressful. Worry, wondering about the unknown, wondering all those things about how it will play out and how you'll manage everything. There can be some relief if your loved one in recovery has been through treatment, is working in recovery, is working towards change, about the promise of that change, or agreements or promises to do better, to stay sober, that this holiday will be different. And sometimes there is excitement and anticipation that stays too. I see some people adding to the chat, asking about, should I not allow my guests to drink, and explain why, which we are going to talk about a little bit later on in the presentation, in terms of just looking at some of those boundaries for how you want to approach the holidays. Okay. I saw somebody else added, being ready and willing to make everything okay and fun, no matter what is really happening. So the idea of, again, the presentation of things versus what you're really feeling and experiencing. Okay. And I see concern that if we invite him and won't be able to tell that he's been using, and then he's there with you, how can we assess clean and sober from afar? Okay, so again, the question of, how will we know if things are going the way that they're supposed to? How do we keep this the way that we want it to be? And so I think that too, the idea of whether to invite, how to approach that, I think we will get more into some of that as we get a little bit further into the presentation, okay? Thank you everybody for your contributions to this. So I think we're going to move on to the next thing and look at one last part of this warm up here.
So these answers are, really great. I got goosebumps reading some of them, right? Like, this stuff is so powerful, and the feelings that come up, and what do I do, and wanting to do the right thing, and even tying in some of those what ifs. What if I do the right thing, the wrong thing? What if it works, it doesn't work? So there's just a lot of anxiety that can come up with this. So what I want to say is, like, while we're in this warm up, if at any point, we're in this process and you have more questions or you need a little bit more, please ask that. If we're at the end of the presentation and you feel like you're still not sure about that, please ask, okay? Lucia and I are here for you all this afternoon or this evening. So if there's something that you're sitting on, please give a voice to it so that we can help just like brainstorm and navigate that with you, okay? Mm-hmm. So we've talked about what we think of when we hear holiday season. We've identified some feelings. And now the hard part is like, so what do I do with all this, right? When I think a certain way, I feel a certain way, and then I act a certain way, right? So it's like just really like cognitive behavioral stuff, right? Mm-hmm. So we've identified all of those feelings. We've identified all of those thoughts. So now in the warm up is like, what do you do with that? So if you're comfortable, like I said, whether it's unmuting yourself or just typing in the chat, what do you do with all this? What behaviorally does that look like? Keeping them to yourself? Work my Al-Anon 12 steps.
Yes.
That's a good one. I've avoided in the past so as not to have to address questions. Mm-hmm. Yep. Talk with a safe person, a sponsor.
Hi, my name's Eileen. I'd like to share if I may.
Yes, please. Hi, nice to meet you.
Hi, my name's Eileen. I'm a person in long-term recovery from alcohol. I'm in Al-Anon, Codependence Anonymous, and I just joined Eating Disorders Anonymous. So I'm a 12-step person. I believe in it wholeheartedly. I'm glad to be here. Thank you for all the efforts to bring this to us tonight. I think for me, part of what I do is that, you know, being a highly sensitive person, I take things on rather than just letting them develop, or when it's over, I have to find something negative. So I do appreciate the positive spin on things. I have a son who's, I can't be sure of where he is, and he probably isn't going to come this year, and that makes it difficult too. But then again, if he does come, then I get anxious in my stomach as to what's going to happen if he does. I've learned to be able to, the best I can, to remember to mind my own square, if you will, that I don't have any control over anybody. I'm totally powerless over those around me. And sometimes my own family doesn't show up, and I'm there with, you know, my daughter's in-laws, and at times that can be very difficult, because I wanted, and I talked to somebody safe today about this, I want that family that looks like I want it. I want that illusion of what I think a family should be. And my family is not like that, but I have to remember that my family is just exactly the way it is. And that nothing I can do at this point with 3 adult children, 7 grandchildren, it's going to change because I want it to. The only person that can really change is me, and I have to adapt. I have to adapt to how that feels. So at the end of these things, like after Thanksgiving, you know, I had a day of just afterburn, if you will. And, you know, I was around drinking, and I did what I had to. I called my sponsor, and I talked to safe people, and I worked myself through that, and asked, you know, of course, my higher power to give me the grace to be able to just accept things as they are, not as I would like them, and to remember that no one's going to be perfect. And I have that perfection gene, that I want it all to be perfect, and that is not a human thing. It's not human to be perfect, and I have to accept that too. So I set my timer, but I wanted to thank you all again, just to let you know that I appreciate it, and the fact that we're not alone in this. We have each other, and we have our people. You know, I have to go to my people. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Eileen. I appreciate you sharing that, and really being able to recognize just through your own work, the concept of powerlessness, right? Like as family members, it can be like, well, if I just try hard enough, maybe I can change them, right? So really being able to practice acceptance, the concept of family of choice can be really difficult, and feel really sad as well. Like I've got these 3 adult children. I have a husband and 2 adult children, or whatever everyone's dynamic looks like, right? And in our minds, we have this idea of that like picture perfect family. And in reality, it can be very different. And that can feel lonely, cause isolation, comparison, like comparing out, like all of these things, right? So I love that you were able to identify ways that you need to like reach out to people. You use the word, I found a safe person, talking to a sponsor. So just kudos to you for taking a risk on here with all of us, and then continuing to do the next right thing. It's work. This is hard, right? And this part that we're in right now, that action, this is where responsibility for recovery comes into place, because I know what I'm thinking, I know what I'm feeling, and now what am I going to do with all this, right? Which way am I going to go? So I saw some other things pop up in the chat here, just as you were sharing. So keeping myself, Al-Anon, Steve said, avoided in the past, not have questions, talk with safe person. So there's that word safe again, right? And we're going to get into that word a little bit later, because I think it really matters who you speak to about what is going on, like for you, with other people. Say my Serenity Prayer over and over. Yes. Avoid asking questions. Sorry, my thing is a little jumpy here. Talk with sponsor. Give my son choices to see what would make him most comfortable. I love that, because sometimes we don't ever ask the patient, right? We can just make assumptions on what we think is needed or what we think would be helpful. And sometimes we're off in that, And it's really with the best of intent to try to like help keep things comfortable and help keep things flowing. And sometimes you really miss the mark on that because our stuff is getting in the way with what that actually could look like. So having that conversation and communication. Let's see. Accept my feelings and practice self-care. Accepting my feelings, that can be really hard to do, right? Because again, if I like just try hard enough. So acceptance is another word that we've used now a few times. Trying to stay busy with cooking, hosting, to avoid the thoughts and feelings. So I guess in some ways, what we're saying there is like avoidance, right? So if I just stay busy enough, then I don't need to think about it. And the reality of it is like, this stuff doesn't go away. So that avoidance, it could help temporarily, then it's still there, right? So hopefully as we talk about some things tonight, maybe there's, you know, a suggestion or two or something that would be of help. And if not, we can certainly come back to that if you're comfortable like chatting more about it in an open forum. And there's balance in all of this, right? That shade of gray. It's okay if you do this some of the time, but if it's always, then when do you deal with your feelings? When do you give a voice to things?
Mhm.
Let's see. Perfect from my perspective is different from what's perfect to someone else. Yes, exactly.
Love that.
I try to suppress my own anxiety over my son, who is a heroin addict, to protect the happiness of everyone else in the family. Oops, during celebrations. That's a heavy one. Thank you for sharing that. What do you do when you're at a holiday party and you abstain and your son gets upset or feels bad because they don't drink? We're going to get into that one. So you're in the right spot. We'll cover some of these later. Just like, what do you do with the alcohol? Do you have it? Do you not?
Mhm.
All right. That's some really good stuff. So Lucia, you want to go ahead and click it for me?
Sure.
So some of these you've all mentioned, right? So the good news with that, and to Eileen's point, is it just goes to show you're not alone, right? So here we have this like open form of discussion, and then also some other common examples are isolate or avoid. So when I'm, you know, when all this is going on for me, I'm just not going to deal with it. I'm just going to put my head in the sand. I'm just going to stay busy, and I'm just not going to deal with it.
Mhm.
I'm going to keep to myself because then I don't have to worry about what other people might say or what other people might think. So it's easier to just be alone than have to deal with it. Stuffing feelings, not allowing yourself to feel, right? Not accepting what it is that you're feeling, just putting it away. The other side of that is like micromanaging and controlling, right? So I'm just going to do it all, and I'm going to make sure that everything stays in this nice little box and that everything's okay. And that can be absolutely exhausting, right? Because it's the illusion of control. Like, let me just try hard enough. I'm going to plan out every single thing. I'm going to ask 1,000 questions. Everyone else is probably a little over it, or like, you know, kind of drive them a little bonkers with it. But what if I don't do that? Then what happens, right? If I don't take care of all of these things, if I don't do it all, what's the alternative? Unhealthy behaviors with eating, shopping, etc. Some of this comes even with stuffing feelings. I don't feel good right now, so I'm going to do maybe some unhealthy things that make me feel good. I'm going to eat 25 chocolate chip cookies. I'm going to go and buy that $300 dress that I wanted. So just being aware of what comes up for you. Some other things, like we mentioned, it's not all like quote unquote negative, right? So there are some things that we can do, such as calling someone who can relate, journaling, having a space, whether it's like freehand on a notepad, whether it's on your phone and like a little note thing on your phone, an actual computer, but just having a place where you're really able to get that out of you. Some of you are on here that I've worked with. I'm a big fan of the believer of like, if you give something a voice, it takes the power away. So just getting it out of you, you'll feel lighter, right?
Mhm.
And asking for help, that's a big one. It's a hard one, and it's so important.
Mhm.
I'm just going to scroll up here because I saw some chats come through. So the holiday party we'll get into.
Mhm.
And then we have What do you do? What to do if your child relapses around the extended family? What to do when family members ask whether or not they can drink around your child? My default is to withdraw and isolate, but I'm learning through my work in Al-Anon with Lucia as a parent coach, learning to share, express self, walk in woods to decompress. Yeah, that self-care stuff works. Good stuff.
Nice.
So we'll keep moving on the different slides and such. We'll get into some of this. And again, if we're, kind of closing in on the hour or so and you feel like you've not quite gotten these answers, just throw them right back in the chat and we'll make sure to answer them. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lucia.
So we wanted to break down our content into first planning. We really encourage the folks that we work with to be proactive and think about the challenges and the situations that you're going to be in and try to have a plan as much as we can. So we're going to start by just talking about some scenarios and some ways that you can approach that. And then we'll shift over into how we utilize communication and boundaries to deal with some of these situations. Okay, so I'm going to start us off talking about some aspects of planning. So oftentimes in our work with clients and families, and we're talking about the holidays, we're looking at what's coming up. So as we know, there's many things that are happening this time of year. There are family parties, there's work parties, there's different events, there's, fundraisers or, specific things, different kinds of get-togethers, you name it, right? So there are a lot of things that maybe we're invited to, a lot of things that are traditional that you're accustomed to doing this time of year. And so what we encourage our clients and their families to do is to look at what are those things that are on the table and have a discussion about what do we think we can attend? Are there some that maybe we think we just can't? There's too much drinking there, it's too high risk. Maybe there's family or friends there that you used to use with, or is there a way to find a middle ground? Can you maybe go for a period of time, but not stay for the whole thing? Can you find a way to be a part of it, just not entirely as you're accustomed to doing? So just looking at, is there a way, can we sort of weigh and really think about and evaluate what can be manageable, what can be healthy, in the circumstances with where you are. And we really want to encourage people to think about, where is your loved one at in their recovery process? Where are you at in your recovery process? So if somebody is really brand new in recovery, we are usually going to encourage a lot of caution and to really be conservative in the situations that you put yourself in. Versus maybe if you're in recovery for a longer amount of time and you have more established support and skills, you may be able to tolerate more. So just kind of looking at what's there and, how much can you manage, especially if there are several things to go to and make room for, okay? I think we try to prepare for the expected as much as we can. And a lot of that, we know our family, we know our friends, we know these circumstances, we can predict a lot of things. And those things that have been difficult in the past, or those events where maybe things have been problematic, we can prepare and anticipate to a certain degree, right? And there might be other things where the unexpected happens, right? Where we can't plan for everything. And if there is something unexpected that comes up, can we have some support in place or have some people that we can utilize to help us problem solve, okay? We've talked about traditions. This is a big one. Just going back to, what do we feel when we think about the holidays? There are some really strong, significant emotional attachments that we have or can have when thinking about holidays. Thinking about the idea of family gathering, joy, traditions, this thing that we always do. And traditions can be a really great thing in terms of, holding us together and keeping, it can be a part of consistency. It can feel safe that there's this tradition that we always do. So the idea that we may not keep them exactly as they are can be really challenging. So we talk about the idea of, can we keep the old and also make room for the new? And these are things that can really vary from situation to situation. So when we think about attachment to tradition, sometimes I think that there can be a rigidity that develops where we can be so focused on the way that we have done things or the way that we think we want things to be, that it can be hard to flex, to make room for recovery, and maybe to adjust things in a way that would help accommodate that. And when traditions change, circumstances change, things are different. I think we all went through this with COVID too, so probably doubly so. There can be a grief with that, with the acceptance of seeing how things are different, seeing that things are changing, knowing that they may not be what they once were. And it doesn't mean that it can't be good, but different can be hard to cope with. And so we really do encourage the idea of flexibility, and finding a way to find compromise. Being able to talk it through with everybody and find that middle ground, find a way where maybe you can keep some of those important components of your traditions, but also keep safety in mind, keep your wellness in mind, okay? So a lot of times when we have traditions of maybe hosting family, hosting friends, hosting get-togethers, or planning get-togethers, we encourage to sort of think outside the box or get creative, right? So traditionally, we like to eat. There can be a lot of drinking and different things. So is there a way to maybe change that or modify that in a way that's more accommodating to recovery or less focused on perhaps alcohol and partying, things like that? So we give the example of like host a breakfast, or maybe you make appetizers as like a middle stop before a last get together that you might be going to, so that it's not something that would be so focused around perhaps drinking, or making some modifications in something like coffee bar, hot cocoa bar, kind of seasonal, like what are they called, mocktails, that don't have any alcohol, where you can have some fun with it and you can use your creativity, but the focus is shifted. Just think about, are there other ways for us to get together and be together, but have the focus be shifted away from so much drinking that can often take place, okay? Part of this is that in your family unit or whatever your system is that you're thinking about and that you're here at this presentation to think about what you're comfortable with in terms of alcohol. So families may approach this in different ways. Some will really err on the side of caution and say, we don't want to have alcohol served. We don't want to have it present. It's going to be an event where we have other beverages, but they're not alcoholic, and that's where we're at. And you let anybody who's attending know that. There are some who may say, we're not going to provide any alcohol, but if somebody wants to drink a beer, wants some wine, they can bring it with them when they come, and they can take it with them when they leave. So that if somebody wants it, they can have it, but it's not something that you're going to be involved in. And there are some families who might say, we're okay with having some there. It's not as much of a, it's not as much of a trigger, it's not as much of a struggle for us. And I think it's really important for everybody to find their individual comfort zone in these things, and to have an idea of how you want to manage that going into these events, okay? And the other thing is the idea of expectations. So I think we touched on this before. I think it's very important for us to be able to talk about what our expectations are and try to align them as much with reality as we can. It can be very difficult not to compare the picture perfect things that are presented to us in movies, or different things where the holidays can look different than how they actually are. And with all the things that we shared about at the beginning during the warm-up, we know that there are a lot of challenges that come up. So I think it's important always to have a dialogue, to evaluate within yourself and with your loved ones, what are our expectations of how we want this to go? And, can we really be honest with ourselves and realistic about what's attainable for us and what's healthy for us? And if there are expectations that other people may have, that we can address that with them. And that's a point where we'll have to use some boundaries perhaps, so that we can do what's best for us for recovery. So I will scroll on from this. I know Laura's going to talk about some other aspects, and then I think if there are circumstances that we want to touch on, perhaps we can do that. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, thank you. All right. So one of the things that I want to say as we're talking about this planning for the holidays and what that all looks like is to know that this could change, right? So if you had this plan, or if there was conversation in November for Thanksgiving, it might not be the same plan for other holidays that you're celebrating that are coming up, because maybe some things were learned or there were some experiences. So I think it's really important to keep the communication around this open, and to know and understand and offer patience to your patient or your loved one, the identified patient, that just because they were okay with something 2 weeks ago doesn't necessarily mean that they might be okay with it this weekend. Or if this weekend, isn't great, that doesn't mean that they might not want to try it again in 2 weeks. So I just want to offer that, to keep that in mind, that these are good things to revisit, not for like the next, say, month, right? To bring these up with different events that are coming up, to really like have an individualized conversation versus like a blanket plan for the whole season. Because if the people change, if the environment changes, if the place changes, how all of you feel about it could also change, right? So exit strategies. We talk about this one with our patients regularly as well. So if you're somewhere, like have a way to leave, have a plan to leave. So sometimes it might feel a little uncomfortable, like we're going to this family gathering and we drove separately. Like, what is going on?
Mm-hmm.
That's okay, right? So the idea of how we're supposed to look, we should all come together, we should all leave together. Maybe that doesn't work for you, right? Maybe you're going somewhere where your patient is really not sure, your loved one's not sure, and maybe it's better if you drive separate. Maybe you're somewhere and you're feeling triggered, or you have anxiety because the last time you were here, it didn't go well. So these things work for both the family member or the identified patient. So driving your own vehicle, have a reason to leave early. Nothing like having a good plan to go somewhere else, right? Just, I have somewhere to go. I'm sorry, I have to go get a root canal, right? Like, I'd rather be anywhere but here right now. So having a plan to be able to say, like, hey, you know what, we actually, and you can disclose whatever you want, but maybe it's a meeting that you're going to. Maybe it's a phone call with a sponsor, like just some sort of commitment that, like, look, I've got this thing to go to if it's not going well. And again, maybe there's flexibility in that. So maybe you say to a sponsor, a safe person, a friend, hey, I've got this family lunch. I'm really not sure how it's going to go. Can we like tentatively meet for coffee at 4? Right? So you have someone and you have that exit plan, you have that commitment. But if it's going well, then maybe you can just shoot a text like, hey, I'm good, I'll call you on my way home. But there's at least an option for you to be able to leave if you have to. Sometimes being people pleasers or like wanting to stuff feelings, all those things we listed earlier, can really prevent us then from asking for what we need or doing what we need for self-care. Maybe we feel guilty, we don't want to upset anybody, we left early before. So having that commitment would maybe alleviate some of those feelings. Bring your own non-alcoholic drinks. So this could be something where, again, having a conversation with the patient, having something, I kind of equated that if you were on a diet, or if you had a food allergy, or you had, certain things that you were only eating, maybe when you go somewhere, you're going to bring a dish that you'll eat so you don't go hungry, right? I'm a super picky eater. So I'm like, I'm going to bring some mac and cheese so I know I don't go hungry at this thing. So it's the same with if you go somewhere, that way you're not tempted, you're not offered, you have a drink in your hand. It's not a matter of there's nothing here for me to drink, for my loved one to drink. So that could be something as well, as far as having non-alcoholic drinks available. And to Lucia's point, some people, it could be flavored water, it could be soda, it could be coffee, right? Some people, when they stop drinking, they might start drinking, Diet Coke all day, every day. So, just really being able to just compromise and figure something out for that. So my screen is blocking this. Hold on here. My son is currently in recovery in Florida. We expect to be home for Christmas. Are you aware if he is getting any sort of how to deal with the upcoming holiday type counseling, similar to what you're describing in this presentation? So I would like to imagine that there is conversation around that. And I would say that that's a really great question to just talk with the family therapist about down there, as far as like, hey, can we make this part of our discussion before he comes home? So it's absolutely okay for you to ask for that. Like, it's your family session. So if you have something on your mind that you want to make sure is covered prior to discharge, absolutely. Okay. Be prepared with simple responses for questions that may come up about your loved one's treatment, abstinence, recovery. Discuss what responses your loved one is comfortable with beforehand. So this is a really important one as well, because like, what does that look like, right? So if we're at this family gathering, or we're somewhere that we haven't been before, what if someone comes up to me and says like, well, why isn't he drinking? Why aren't you drinking? So just so you're not caught off guard, you don't owe your story to anyone, right? You don't have to sit there and be like, well, there was this time and they drank too much and we ended up in treatment. So, because sometimes what happens is we can get really anxious and we start to like become hyper verbal and just tell everyone everything. And you don't have to do that. Again, you don't owe that explanation to anyone. The purpose of it being noted here is so that you're not caught off guard and that you don't get off your mark, right? So being able to, if someone asks you about your patient, hey, why don't you go ask him or go ask her, right? Like, you don't have to feel like you have to be the keeper of that answer. So the conversation though could look like, hey, if someone asks why you're not drinking, how do you want me to answer that? And sometimes the level of comfort of honesty varies with people. Sometimes it's like, well, just tell them I don't drink anymore. Tell them I'm in recovery. And then other people might say, well, let's just say we're just not drinking right now. Or, there might not be as much transparency with it, depending on the environment and who you're with. Consider and process expectations, resentments, triggers that may arise that you may need to deal with. So when we go into the holiday season, it's not, and you could even find this at other times of year, whether it be like birthdays or, different celebrations. But sometimes what can happen is the idea of, so the last time we were here, like, didn't go well. The last time this happened. So there can be this like period of reflection, of remembering what came up or what happened the last time that you were in this environment. So really being able to talk with your loved one about that. We really believe in the idea of a parallel process. So the idea of like what goes on with the patient, such as like triggers, shame, guilt, like all of those things, working a program, healing, all of those things can happen for the family member as well. So as a patient can be triggered, a family member can also be triggered. So really being able to say to your loved one, look, I need to let you know that these old people, places, and things, right? Or when you say that you're going to lunch with Tony, like, I feel anxious. So being able to voice what your needs are and what comes up for you when you start to think about the past or start to think about these scenarios where you may be really uncomfortable because you're not sure what that looks like, or historically it has not gone well. Talking about the different expectations. Again, like, what time do you want to leave? How long do you want to stay? Are we having the alcohol? Are we not having the alcohol? And just really making sure that as you're talking about all of these different expectations, you might not agree on them, right? So what could be really important to you, your patient may think you're overreacting, like it's not that big of a deal. So really being able to process those expectations. Are they realistic? And how much control of those expectations do you have, right? There is something to be said for expectations lead to resentments. So am I sitting here expecting that somebody else is going to do all this stuff? Or is it more of like a discussion where we're just agreeing on a plan? Because you also don't want to set yourself or your loved one up for failure either. So the word expectations is a heavy word. It's a big word, and it needs to be something where almost even interchangeable on like agreement, right? So consider and process like what it is that we are both agreeing to, or we as a family are agreeing to. And then, expect the unexpected. If you get there and somebody comes up and just hands your loved one a drink, right? Some people in social situations that are not necessarily, I don't know if respectful is the word, but respectful of the, like, no, I'm not, oh, just have one. Oh, you can have one. And then some people also don't understand the gravity of what it means to be sober, right? Like, no, I really can't drink successfully. Oh, you can have just one, or, oh, it's not liquor, right? It's just beer. So again, just really being mindful that these different things can come up for you while you're there. Oops, hold on, we have something from, I did not realize I was messaging only one person. I'm going to repeat my comment that I tell others that I'm on a lot of medications. Is this smart? Yeah, so I think Jesse, it's like what works for you, right? So some people will say like, I'm on medication right now. Like I'm not drinking.
Mhm.
It could be like, hey, I'm driving. So I think it's a matter of like what works for you, right? And what are you comfortable with? So really, and again, remembering that you don't owe anyone your story or your loved one's story. So if you feel like confident in that and it kind of it can stay there, and that feels like a safe answer for you, I think that's good. What if my loved one isn't willing to discuss all of the things you suggest? My first reaction, Francie, is tell them to call us. We'll have this conversation with you. Yeah, sometimes they're not interested. I don't want to hear it. I don't want to do this. And in all seriousness, that may be the time to ask for help in that conversation then, right? How do I navigate a conversation with my loved one that isn't willing to discuss it? That's really hard because we need both people to participate in this. And sometimes, like, again, that parallel process, all of the things that we noted as family members, stuff, isolate, avoid, I don't want to deal with it. Patients have that too, right? So like, can we just not talk about it? Like, it's fine. And that could be for a variety of reasons. Maybe they don't think it's that bad. Maybe it's shame and guilt. So I think really being able to say what you need, right? I know this conversation is one that you don't have to have, and it's really important to me that we have it. So can we agree that by the weekend, we'll have had found time to have this conversation, right? You have to be able to just communicate with one another, and what you have to say matters. So maybe they don't give a lot back in the conversation, but some sort of forum where you're able to have those conversations is really important. And sometimes having a third party, whether it be a marriage counselor or recovery coach, available to help navigate that can also be helpful. What do you do if your child relapses around the extended family? So would that be a first use, or I don't know, Trish, I don't want to put you on the spot. So whatever you're comfortable, whether it's typing or talking.
I was not thinking of a first use. I was thinking of an actual relapse of drug use around the family.
So just to give the example, so say you're hosting a holiday party and they relapse during that holiday party.
Yeah.
So,
And Laura, in our case, he'd be flying to family. We'd be staying with the grandparents and he'd be staying with us in the grandparents' house for whatever amount of time we decided to, you can, fly in for 2 days or something like that.
how old is he?
20. And he just finished a 9-month program at Ascend Recovery in Salt Lake City.
Nice. And has he had sobriety thus far? For 9 months?
Theoretically.
Yeah, I mean, to our knowledge, yes.
Yeah, good. So that's all good stuff, right?
Yeah.
So here's the thing. Relapse is a
So
process.
the last time we had Christmas with him, it was disastrous.
Mhm. Yeah. So that's what happens, right? Again, here we are, the last time. It was a disaster. So naturally, most people are going to go into this holiday season with that same anxiety. Like, this didn't go well before. This was a mess. This was a disaster. This was a poop show. This ended in tears and fighting and like you need to get out. So now we're like taking a risk and leaning into the idea that something could be different, right? So here's the what if it goes really well? What if he's had 9 months of sobriety and this year's different? So I absolutely I have goosebumps. I want to validate like the sheer fear and concern because of the last time, and to not forget the 9 months of treatment he has under his belt, right? So what we also need to remember that relapse is a process, not an event. So the time that it takes someone to relapse, it can vary. Some people, it happens really quick. For other people, it could happen over like a 3-month period or a year period. But I think this is where, if he's still in treatment, really like to, I think there was a date, like really having that conversation with the treatment staff while in treatment. What is the plan? How do we get you to grandma safely? Right? Telling on yourself. I'm worried about you traveling alone, or I'm worried when you get there that you may be overwhelmed. What do you need from us? How can we support you? So really proactively having that conversation. I don't want to say it can't happen, but for someone who's been on the, in treatment, in recovery, and I don't know enough about him, but like, if someone is doing what they're supposed to be doing and engaged in the recovery process, a relapse isn't going to just come out of left field, right? There are going to be things going on, behaviors that are going on that are concerning. So like the things we talked about, like thoughts, beliefs, attitudes, old behaviors, all of those things. So I do think that the conversation could be had of, should you struggle or should you return to use, like while we are together, specifically over the holiday? This is what like we would do on our end, right? So like, what is that consequence for him? But really, I mean, at this point, with, again, he's not out of the woods yet, right? He's been in a bubble, in a safe place. But I think really facilitating a conversation around what's his level of concern, what's your level of concern, and then what is needed. So what has he done to kind of be on track, and what will help him stay on track? Is that helpful?
Yeah, it's really helpful. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Lucia, do you have anything to add to that?
I was going to say, I agree with what Laura said about bringing in his treatment providers to have a plan in place. We always like to think about what commitments will the individual in recovery make to go into a situation like visiting families for the holidays and maintain sobriety. So you can commit to calling your sponsor every day. Here are some Zoom meetings you can get on, or here are some local meetings you can get to. What sort of things can he layer in place so that he has support through it, and can be as prepared as possible, because discharge after a lengthy treatment, there's an adjustment, right? So we want people to have as much support around them to help them with that transition. as you can. So I definitely agree with the idea of coming up with a plan and seeing also if the treatment provider has any suggestions if a relapse does occur. Do we look at a return for stabilization? Do we look at something else so that can be defined too?
So Lucia and I have both been clinicians at Caron for quite some time. Lucia is in about her 18th year. I'm like following behind her at like around 17 or so. And I can only speak for us and at Caron, but if there's concern of a patient going somewhere, that's usually part of the conversation, right? So if a clinical team, a multidisciplinary treatment team is working with your loved one, with your son, and they're going, this is just the most high risk situation, I would imagine that that's being verbalized to you, right? So again, you as family members, absolutely advocate for yourself, for your patient, ask those questions. Hey, look, we've not been here before. We know last time this did not go well. I know you don't have a crystal ball, but do you think this is a good idea, him coming here? And they'll weigh in, yeah, because of what we've talked about, all the things Lucia has talked about. Like, I'm talking like a plan from when he leaves treatment to the airport, from the airport to the flight, from the flight to the off the flight. But remembering that that's not yours to figure out, right? He needs to figure out that plan with his therapist. And maybe you're part of that, right? Does he have a sober companion to help travel with him? Is traveling a triggering experience for him? Does he need a sober companion? So there's lots of different ways to navigate that. But really in these moments, keeping it in the I perspective. So I know that I'm really nervous about this because of last year and what would be helpful. Like, how do we support you in this process? Okay. So kind of just piggybacking off of that, the supportive, discuss with supportive friends, family, recovery group, therapist. And it's so important. And it's sometimes it's really hard to admit or say out loud. And I actually want to give kudos to, was it Francie? Sorry, I'm just looking for the name of the person who said when the other person doesn't want to discuss it with you. Yeah, Francie. So I just want to give you kudos, Francie, for that's a hard thing to say, right? To say out loud, they don't want to talk about it with me. That can be a really scary thing to give a voice to. What do you mean they don't want to talk about it with you? Make them talk about it, make her talk about it. And it doesn't work that way, right? So sometimes when you find yourself, I like to call it almost like a stuck point, right? Of like, we can't like get through this. That may be the time, like if you have like almost like this like internal kind of like little flag, that may be the time where it is like, we need to get some professional help, right? So if these conversations are ones that just are not going well, you're hitting a stuck point, it ends up in a blow up. You're not seeing eye to eye. You are just so being dramatic. Everybody drinks around the holidays. We all get a little loose and crazy. Like, I think you're being dramatic. Like if this is some of the stuff that you're being met with, it wasn't that bad. Well, you got drunk before too, like whatever that is. It could be time then to get some help, and that's okay, right? So being able to recognize when something's not working and say like, hey, I'm going to need a little bit more support here. Thank you.
All right. So thank you everybody for your questions and feedback with that. I'm going to just kind of shift us to the next part where we look at communicating through situations and setting boundaries. So, in terms of preparing ourselves and setting ourselves up for hopefully what is effective communication, we do encourage people to be aware of the timing of when you bring these things up. That it's when you have adequate time to talk things through, when maybe your person isn't rushing to get somewhere or, really tired or upset about something else. Even to just kind of plant the seed perhaps beforehand and say something like, the holidays are coming up, or we have some parties that we've been invited to, I'd like for us to talk about, maybe some ways that we want to approach that, or what we're both comfortable with. When can we do that? To kind of put the ball in their court that I want to have this discussion and I want us to figure it out together. When is the time that you can be a part of that conversation in an effective way, right? Just to kind of approach it like a team, right? And Laura and I, in our work with clients and families, we always want to encourage honesty and openness. These are challenging conversations to have. There are hard things to say. There are things that may be hurtful. Oftentimes, we're having these conversations because of painful things that have happened. Because of holidays where things really went wrong, and it was very, very difficult. And we believe that we can be honest and we can really talk through just about anything if everybody involved is willing to be kind and appropriate about it, and open to the other. That part can be difficult, but if we approach these conversations just in the spirit of being solution focused and wanting to look out for ourselves and look out for our loved ones, okay? We want to also, in these conversations, provide a safe space where we just acknowledge that pain has occurred, consequences have occurred. We've been disappointed, we've been let down, we've been afraid. That's happened, and we are trying our best to move forward and approach this holiday differently, approach these events differently. Okay. We also really encourage families and whatever other relationships that you're on this call for, to be open with each other and to share with each other what those sort of triggers are. Whether it be a trigger to drink or use substances, or whether it be an emotional trigger. That's something that we talk about sometimes, where, a certain behavior, certain statements, things like that can be an emotional trigger for family members, where maybe it elicits feelings that remind you of the past, where you get really anxious, you get afraid, you get angry, you start to think that use is happening. So if you can be honest and transparent with each other about some of these triggers that can come up and how we might be able to deal with them. I feel like Laura mentioned something a while ago, the idea of, when I see you going and talking to cousin Jake, who you used to drink with, I get really triggered. I get really worried about that. Just to kind of own your own feelings in that. It doesn't mean that if your loved one's talking to cousin Jake that they're necessarily going to pick up and use, but you remember that, you have that emotional memory, and just to acknowledge that. And also I think if your loved one can be honest with you about the triggers that they experience, so that you can support them in having boundaries or being able to leave the situation if they need to. If they say, I start to see so-and-so really getting intoxicated, and then I just get really triggered. Okay, you can have a signal or something like that, so that if it's time to go, that you're ready to do so, and that you can be together in that. Okay. We also talk about the concept of people, places, and things. So for anybody who's in recovery, who's been around the treatment community, this is a phrase that we hear a lot. Old people, old places, old things. Those that are connected to drinking, using, addiction, unhealthy behaviors, codependency, controlling, whatever the case might be. Again, just having an open dialogue and acknowledging what those people, places, and things are, and how are they connected to some of the events that we might be participating at. How can we maybe work around some of these things, and what do we need to maybe weigh? Yes, we can go to this event and we can have a plan to stay safe through it, or what, it's too much, I don't want to risk it, we're not going to go to that one, right? So just kind of being able to put those things on the table and evaluate if it's manageable or not. Okay. We also want to be able to allow for discussion of how the person in recovery is feeling, and normalize that there may be ups and downs, in some of the, some of the way that they're talking about recovery. We may see people sort of second guessing. Was it really that bad? Maybe something would be manageable. Sort of questioning powerlessness. And that can often be part of the recovery process, especially early recovery. Feeling ambivalent, feeling uncertain as to how they want to navigate things. There can really be a loss around the feeling of being normal, or being able to celebrate holidays in a normal way. Most people drink, most people do this. Why can't I do that, right? And just kind of allowing space for some of those struggles and being able to acknowledge them and talk it through. And I know we have here, if you see something, say something, right? So if you notice something in your loved one that concerns you, if you notice something going on in the situation at the event that you're at that concerns you, that you can go to each other with that, that you can check in with each other about that. You can say, hey, I noticed that this happened. How are you doing? Are you doing okay? What's going on? To just be able to touch base on that. Okay. I can't, Laura, just because of my bar at the bottom here, I can't see what the last thing is.
Oh.
Sorry. Can you tell me what that last one
Yeah,
is?
just communicate individual needs.
Okay. Okay, thank you. So we do. I mean, we know that in self-care and when everybody's working their own recovery process, you want to think about what you need going into a situation, right? So we're each responsible for our own recovery, for our own well-being, and to be able to express that to the people around us. So we want our person in recovery to be able to advocate for themselves as well, to be able to identify what they need, and to be able to have a discussion about this. It may not always align perfectly, but can we find some common ground, or can we find a way to compromise and move forward together? I saw something came up on the chat here. Just gonna look at that quick. All right, your daughter was also, so we have someone else who has a daughter, had a daughter at Ascend, has been out about a month. When I tried to set boundaries with her before she was supposed to come home for Thanksgiving, she thought you were being controlling. We didn't want her using the car when she came home, and then she became so angry that she didn't talk to us for a week. The car was always an issue, and she felt that we still thought of her the way she was before going to treatment. That's a tough situation. So it's new. It sounds like she's been home about a month, and that beginning period when somebody is transitioning out of a structured setting like treatment back to home, back to some of the, the privileges and the freedoms and the abilities that they had prior to treatment, that is a time usually of high anxiety. So from a family member's perspective, you may want to see some change in progress, or see some demonstration of a change in behaviors before giving use of the car, which is the way that it sounds like you approached it. And I think that's fair. The person coming out of treatment might feel like, I've just been in treatment all this time. I've worked so hard. I've made these changes. Why can't I still have this yet? And it really can be a point of contention. So I can really appreciate that had to be such a difficult situation to go through. And really a situation where I feel like, you weren't seeing eye to eye, that you probably both had valid points. It was so new and so fresh and so vulnerable that we often do encourage folks to practice caution and ease into some of these things. And unfortunately, it can sometimes cause conflict. Okay, I'm just looking here. My loved one sometimes second guesses whether or not it was really that bad. I'm not sure what the correct response is. Do I just listen? My response would be, I think that you can understand and you can listen and validate that ambivalence is a normal part of recovery. It comes and goes, right? For any of us, not just with the recovery process, but any change process, I think we can all have days where maybe we feel super committed to it, resolute, all in, and other days where you're kind of like, oh, am I really doing this? Do I really have to do this? Right? So that can ebb and flow, and that can be expected. And when we have the people that we work with where they might verbalize that and they may say, sometimes I wonder if it was that bad. I think it's good to just review back to your whys, right? What brought you to treatment? What brought you to recovery? What has kept you committed to it before? What have those consequences been? To just kind of review that and bring it back to why we chose to invest in recovery in the first place. I don't know, Laura, if you want to add to either of these that I just talked about.
I think one of the things that just came up for me is that, setting boundaries when boundaries maybe didn't exist before. I often kind of joke that, like, if you're setting a boundary correctly, you're probably going to get some pushback because you're putting parameters in a place that there were none before. So I think one of the hardest things and most important things to do is that if you are setting that boundary, you're sticking to it. So I would say, kudos for being able to deal with that, and kind of like the emotional response then of like ignoring for a week, like that's a lot. And even like revisiting that, and then at some point, if there's some sort of like support, whether it be family therapy or whatever that looks like for you all, like, hey, look, this isn't acceptable, right? This is the boundary. We are the adults, you are the child. And then, to act this way for X amount of time is inappropriate. Boundaries are really hard when you're doing them correctly. So
Yes.
it's difficult. There's another one on here about, so Brenda and Francie, if you're both still with us, there was a question earlier about siblings. I would also like advice for siblings that are not sympathetic and have bad feelings for the chaos caused in the family. And then the one above was just kind of like, how do you treat what do you do when siblings aren't sympathetic to the alcoholic?
It was the same question.
Okay.
So
It sounds very similar.
yeah, it really does. So again, like, just to show you're not alone in that, right? It's not uncommon for children to get resentful or frustrated or annoyed with the identified patients. Do they seem to have a different set of rules, expectations on them? Are they allowed to do stuff, right? So kind of an understanding of like what seems like they get away with a lot can sometimes come up. Seeing the amount of attention and energy and focus, and maybe even money, right? Financial aid, whether it's in treatment or legal fees, the emotional consequence of seeing parents just distraught by having a child in active addiction. So it is not uncommon for that resentment, that's my word, I don't think it was listed, but for that resentment to exist in the relationship. And I think similarly to as like adults, as we need to heal, children do as well, right? So really being able to validate their frustration, living with addiction. Again, so if you have a set of parents and then the child is the addict, that splashes all through the house. So it doesn't just stay in the parent-child relationship. It goes over to other siblings as well. So family meetings, family counseling, providing a safe space for the non-identified patient child to be able to say, like, I'm really frustrated. Were they put in any positions of having to kind of like secret keep or lie or minimize? So there could be a whole set of dynamics that exist in that relationship as well. But I certainly think family meetings is a good place to start, and really an understanding of addiction as a disease for that, non-patient child, and and really educating them. I think even amongst that age group, it can be difficult. Why didn't they just stop, right? They know that they're not supposed to do this. Like, so you can kind of get into black and white thinking if you're younger and haven't had a whole lot of exposure to like the educational part of things. Most children, and obviously age matters as well, but most siblings are just seeing that their sibling has caused chaos and like hurt or like ruined the family, right? So really just providing a space for them to process all of that.
I love, Eileen, what you said about trust and boundaries. And trust really is difficult to reestablish. And I think I just want to validate that for a minute. Oftentimes we've said trust is gained in drops and lost in buckets, right? It's really easy to just kind of smash that wall down with a relapse or with certain behaviors, and it comes back so slowly. And that can be a barrier at times. It can be a really frustrating place, especially for the person who's in recovery to be, when they are working hard and they are making changes and they feel like they can't put their life back together as quickly as they want to, or deal with those consequences as quickly as they want to, just to validate that. And I agree. Boundaries are a way to show that we've changed, and they are challenging. Right? Setting a new precedent, setting new patterns. We often push back against what we're not accustomed to, even if we know it's for the best, right? So thank you for that. I'm going to go to the next one. I'm good with that, Laura?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Let's see. So feelings around not using, both person in recovery and family members, loved ones, whether others are abstaining or not. So we've talked about that as far as like what does that use look like for you? And knowing that as a family member, even if your patient is saying like, look, you're not the one with the problem, quotes, right? You're allowed to drink. Sometimes like you might not want to for your own reasons of just feeling anxiety or like, well, I don't want to trigger them, or, if they're not able to do it, then maybe I shouldn't. So just being able to recognize what comes up for you around that, which you mentioned this earlier, but just acknowledging the grief about changes, relationships, and traditions. There may be things that, as you get into the first that you're not doing. So like we mentioned before, this doesn't have to be always. So it's not that you can't ever do A, B, and C again, or you can't ever go here again. But maybe right now in the early stages of recovery, let's try that next year, or for this year, let's just do this. Let's see, I'm just not seeing eye to eye. So learning how to have that compromise and, really being able to talk about what it is that you need. Have a family meeting to provide an opportunity to discuss these concerns, plans, et cetera, and including children. So I think this is really, we kind of just touched on this, but I think it's really important, especially if it's the child of, right? So being able to have a safe space for your child to be able to talk about what it's been like for them to watch mom or dad, in active addiction, especially if everyone's living under the same household. It's a little different if there's adult children. But really just being able to have those discussions and have the communication.
And I will say too that, I think sometimes, if we're talking about children, they can feel reassured in a family meeting if you're saying, yes, we're going into this situation. It was difficult before, we struggled before, and I have a plan. This is what I'm going to do to go about this differently, right? So just showing how we're navigating that change. Okay, so we also want to make sure, I know we're getting close to time here, that we touch on the idea of boundaries. So there are different types of boundaries to consider when looking at these different situations and how we navigate them. It might be physically where you go, what you participate in, who you spend time around, right? And putting some limits around that. It might be emotional. It might be that if there are dynamics with certain family members or loved ones or friends where they're not going to be supportive of recovery, or they might be abusing substances themselves, or it will put a strain on that person's recovery process to be around them, then emotionally we distance ourselves for a while. It might be that we're not really communicating with them in the way that we normally would through the holidays, or we're not going to be spending time with them to preserve recovery or to preserve well-being. And that can be really difficult to set. But really evaluating, looking at yourself and your own needs and wellness, setting those emotional boundaries. It might be financial. We haven't gotten a whole lot into this, but so much of the holidays can be about gift giving, or putting money towards certain events, things like that. And we just want to really support and validate that it is okay to put some boundaries and some limits around financial spending too, because that can be something else that really contributes to stress and worry for us if we're overextending ourselves beyond what's comfortable or what's manageable. And time as well, right? So we've talked about in terms of planning that we can and may need to limit how much time we spend at certain events or gatherings versus what we used to do, certain people, those sorts of things. And so to really evaluate, what can I do and how can I structure it, right? So just to kind of think of all those different elements of the limits that we're setting. Say no if needed and say no for you, right? We talked about people pleasing before. It can be so hard to turn down things, especially if we have mixed feelings about it. Maybe there's a lot of you that wants to go and participate. Maybe you don't want to let go of that certain tradition. Maybe you don't want to disappoint somebody or let them down. And no can be a complete sentence too, right? And so as we talked about before, remembering to prioritize your emotional well-being, your health. And as Laura said earlier, if you're going to set a boundary, it's so important that you maintain it. So to establish something that you feel like you can follow through with. If we set a boundary and break it, it can really be a setback in terms of that change process and establishing these newer, healthier patterns. See that something popped up here.
We're good. I
Somebody
think
has to drop off. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
So anything else on the idea of boundaries? I think a lot of this kind of been woven into our discussion so far. And I do want to be mindful of us ending on time. So I think I'm just gonna move us over to our last part here.
Yep. So Eileen says, my sponsor had said, don't set a boundary if you don't intend to follow through and hold that boundary. Yes. I'm also a big believer of if you're setting a boundary properly, no one can break it except you.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to say that again. If you're setting a boundary properly, no one can break it except you, right? Because it's your boundary. So it's what am I doing to take care of myself? Which slides us into self-care. Thank you all for hanging. We're aware that it's 8:28. If you have to jump, we understand. And if you want to hang out because you've nothing else to do tonight, we welcome that too. Some of you look very cozy on your couches. All right. So self-care. It's like so easy to say that, right? So Lucia and I, when we talk, we say, so what do you do for self-care? And sometimes it's like, I don't even know what that means. Like, what does that even mean? So it sounds really fancy. And really it's like, what am I doing to just replenish myself mentally, emotionally, physically, spiritually, right? So what we know is that when we practice self-care, it reduces stress, anxiety, depression, improves concentration, minimizes frustration and anger, increases happiness and self-esteem, improves energy. So if you think about this, like loving someone in active addiction is so very difficult, right? And it can suck everything out of you. because you love them so much, and that doesn't seem to be enough, right? So having that self-care, knowing when to stay in your lane, when to stay in your square, it's really just so important. Addiction takes up so much time. Active addiction takes up so much time and so much energy. So you have to replenish it. We said it earlier, you can't give what you don't have. So I think you can probably go ahead and click Lucia. So practicing self-care can look like continuing to be honest with what's going on for you, right? Sometimes we can like come out of the gate strong. We're like, we just got out of rehab. We're going to talk and sing Kumbaya and have family meetings, and it's going to be great. And then life happens and you can fall into old behaviors. And well, what if I say this and it upsets them? What if I say this and maybe they relapse, they use? So we can really get stuck in fear and we can fall back into old behavior. So continuing to be honest from those conversations earlier with that communication is really important. Practice sharing your feelings, boundaries with a safe person. Be around healthy and supportive people. Embrace family of choice. Decision to drink or abstain from drinking. And that again, like that is your choice. It's not up for your patient to say like, whether, I mean, sure, if they would feel uncomfortable with you drinking, that would be one thing. But just because they're saying you don't have a problem, you can drink, that doesn't mean that you're okay with it. Like you may be uncomfortable for the reasons we mentioned earlier. Utilize support consistently. Bookend events with recovery support. Big fan of this. We talked about it earlier, an exit strategy. But if you know that you're going somewhere that could be difficult, it could be triggering, it could be exhausting. Maybe you hit up a meeting before and do something fun after, right? So bookending those activities. Keep healthy routines intact as much as possible. Healthy eating, maintaining exercise, meetings, connecting with support. These things can be, difficult. And we can maybe relate to even just this past week with Thanksgiving, right? Like if you get out of your routine, sometimes the first thing to go is like the meeting or like, hey, I'm going to have some more mashed potatoes and I'm going to do this. I'm going to go here. I'm just going to go and be around these people for an hour. So we can do all of these small little things and then wonder like, man, I'm kind of irritable. Like what's going on? Oh, well, I've not been in my routine for 4 days is what's going on. So being aware of that. Take recovery on the road. Oh, you guys, you're going to get to know me in a minute here. I get a little passionate when patients, I'm like, hey, like you've been away on vacation. How was it? What'd you do for recovery? And they're like, I was on vacation. It's like, if you're diabetic, do you take your medicine on vacation or do you just leave it at home and like hope for the best for the week, right? Like you probably bring it with you. So that mindset of taking recovery on the road, and especially now with like everything being virtual, there's really no reason to have lack of connection right now, right? Unless it's like a serious choice of just not interested. So calling, phone, texting, reading a book, all of those things. Sober or support a friend. Remind yourself that you're not responsible for your loved one's recovery or feelings. That is a big one, and it like is said easily, and it's so hard, right? Because those what ifs that we talked about earlier. So you are not responsible for your loved one's recovery the same exact way you weren't responsible for their active addiction, right? The 3 C's, if anyone's in Al-Anon, didn't cause it, can't control it, can't cure it. So really keeping that in mind. Volunteer to be of service. Sometimes just getting outside of your own self can be helpful. So whether that's going to an animal park and walking dogs, whether it is volunteering at a soup kitchen, meeting with other women or men and or parents or spouses, like whatever your role is, right? Getting around other people. If you're familiar with the rooms, there is like maybe 1 bazillion different slogans. So keep it simple, sweetheart. We used the nice one. Again, some of you might know that can be a different S on the end there. 1 day at a time. So like some people are like, oh my gosh, AA and the slogans, but they're kind of catchy and they work, right? So just kind of remembering those as well.
Yeah. And if we have one that resonates with us, just like kind of holding on to that in those moments when you're struggling and just connecting to that.
Yep. HALT is another one, just hungry,
Mhm.
angry, lonely, tired. I joke that I'm like the Snickers commercial where they're like, you're not yourself when you're hungry. Like give the person the Snickers. But it's so true. And all of these things are things to keep in mind when we're having those important conversations, right? How am I
Mhm.
feeling right now? Is now a good time?
Okay, so I shifted us on to the last one here. So we've talked a lot about planning and anticipation of things, and we also want to emphasize that you keep talking. And again, that spin of the positive, even if things are going well. So
Mhm.
oftentimes, if change is happening, we're kind of moving away from the difficulty of active addiction and the consequences, and back into a healthier space again. It can be harder to feel that urgency to maybe maintain some of the things that are working. But it is helpful to process and look at just some of these things. Did it go as planned? Like, what do we take away from it? Would you do the same things? Would you change things? We always want to emphasize giving kudos, giving positive feedback. If you see the efforts, if you see somebody changing a behavior that you know is really difficult for them, call that out, acknowledge that. That reinforcement can be really powerful. If you see something where you feel concerned, note that as well. Like, you seem tired, you don't seem like yourself, just to be able to have that dialogue. Talk about ways that you stay on track, celebrate the new traditions. They may turn out to be really fun, even if you didn't expect that. Celebrate those wins. And as we said, include the kids in that, they are a part of it too. Okay.
Someone
love the
like
Serenity Prayer.
slide. I've seen the Serenity Prayer mentioned a few times in the chat. So
Yes.
we have it. Yeah, just the importance to Lucia's point of just continuing to talk when things are going well, right? The patient, the identified patient, and maybe even you as a family member, it's like, oh, I know all about myself when I'm doing something I'm not supposed to be doing, right? So, we have patients sometimes that they'll say, oh, I'm good, I don't really need to talk about anything. And it's like, no, we have to learn how to communicate even when things are going well. So you're welcome, Amanda. So we have the Serenity Prayer. Some of you seemed to be really excited and just mentioned this a few different times. Does anyone in the group want to volunteer to read that before we wrap up?
I'm happy to read it.
It's Betsy. Hey, Betsy.
Hi.
Go for it.
Thank you so much, Lucia and Laura. Thank you for this opportunity to learn and listen and be together. We are a family.
We are.
We are. Yes, God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference.
Yes, yeah. Thank you.
I'm like goosebumping left and right in this meeting. Thank you all.
Yes.
Thank you all.
Right.
From
Thank
Canada, you're most welcome. That's exciting. So don't let the past steal your present, right? As you're going into this new holiday season, it can be a roller coaster of emotions. Please, if there's anything that wasn't covered, or you're just like, oh, I don't know if that was answered all the way, let us know. Again, Lucia Ferrara, Laura Holland, we both work out of my first year. Our info is probably on your invite. So if you're sitting on anything, like, we want to be a resource for you, right? So please reach out and we'll happily do our best to answer your question or get you to someone else who can.
Right. And I see Corey did put the SurveyMonkey link in the chat there. We absolutely welcome everyone's feedback and want to continue to provide you topics that would be helpful and want to continue to improve. So if you can take a minute just to share feedback, we would really love to hear it. Thank you.
And keep being brave and telling your story and just, putting yourself out there. That's how you remember you're not alone. So many of you commented some really personal things. So we see you and we appreciate you. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both ladies. This was a great
Absolutely.
evening.
Thank you. I'm going to tell, may I tell a quick story?
Sure, Betsy.
Okay, I'm just going to tell a quick one about, there are so many points that you both made, you all made, and especially the shares too were touching. And when you repeat the same thing, you can kind of expect the same thing. So we are, in our family, we are dropping a Christmas Eve tradition of 65 years. And if you don't think that's tough, but it's on us, and we're doing it because it's not the right thing for our family any longer. And it's not the right thing for my loved one. And so we're going to scale it down. We're going to keep it simple. We're going to do different things, and we're going to replace old sort of bad memories that we tried to cover up so well with new ones. And there is grief with that. And I'm so glad that you mentioned grief tonight, because grief is a big part of change. And step one is realizing we're powerless. And that is a big piece of grief too, is that we who are Olympic fixers and controllers no longer have that magic wand. We don't have that power. So there's a lot of grief and change, but there's a lot of joy in what that new doorway looks like. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Betsy.
Thank you, Betsy.
All right.
All right.
Thank you all.
Well, again, appreciate everybody's sharing and participation. We enjoyed being with you tonight. So take care and happy holidays to everyone.
You
Happy
too.
holidays. Thank you.
Have a good night.